Did you know that United States and India inked a deal late last month to enable the transfer of closely guarded technology for the design and manufacture of compound semiconductors in India? Do you know that 20% of the semiconductors available globally are compound semiconductors? Did you know that India is home to a fifth of the world's talent to design semiconductors? Hello and welcome to another edition of Capital Calculus. I'm your host Anil Padmanabhan. Late last month, the United States President Joe Biden and his Indian counterpart, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, inked a deal which, for the first time, allowed the United States to transfer a closely guarded technology to design and manufacture compound semiconductors in India, which are used in defense and communications. This deal is expected to open up unprecedented cooperation and collaboration between the two countries in technology across sectors. To unpack the import of this deal, I spoke to Vrinda Kapoor. She is the CEO of Third Eye Tech, a defense startup which is at the center of this deal to productionize the design and manufacture of compound semiconductors in India. But before that, here's a short explainer as to one, what is a compound semiconductor and why is it so important?
With rapid advancement of technology, mankind entails on the path to a future that relies more heavily on machinery than ever before. With handy computers within which is a web of ever-expanding information, vehicles that run on electricity, medical treatments relying majorly on equipment, and household appliances that now are a part of every urban household, inventions surround the humans of today. One such was the integration of semiconductors into electrical circuits. Now, what is a semiconductor? A substance that falls between a conductor, which is capable of conducting electricity, and an insulator, which inhibits the flow of current, meaning that semiconductors possess a unique property of controlling the flow of electrical currents. Elements that show such a property are silicon and germanium. They are used in microchips, integrated circuits, and microprocessors. Within the realm of semiconductor technology and its advancement lies the advent of all modern electronics, from your smartphone to your oven, from your car to your elevator, from your CCTV to your locker. It's everywhere. So, why is it important for India to invest in this domain? As global demand for semiconductor chips continues to grow, it is crucial for India to establish a strong foothold in this market. Largest manufacturers of semiconductors are Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, the US, and China. Currently, India relies heavily on imports for its semiconductor needs, which presents a significant vulnerability. In March 2023, the US-India Memorandum of Understanding was announced as a semiconductor supply chain and innovation partnership. By developing its own semiconductor manufacturing capabilities, India can boost its economy, create jobs, and enhance its technological sovereignty. Understanding their relevance today, their historical significance, and the strategic importance of manufacturing them domestically in India sets the stage for a deeper discussion.
Armed with this basic knowledge, I began by asking Vrinda a very basic question. Why is this deal so important?
So the reason it's significant is because this is one of the most strategic class of military technologies, right? So I know we'll talk about this later on, but semiconductors have so many different applications across the modern consumer economy that often we forget the military applications and the criticality of semiconductors for national security. So really that was the main takeaway, is that this particular deal is focused around building India's sovereign national security infrastructure, right? Providing us sovereign control over our own supply chains reducing our limitations on imports. Really, the essence of what Prime Minister Modi has been talking about since 2019, which is Atmanirbharta in a growing amount of capacities year on year. So that was really the criticality of this deal. The reason it's so significant and I think so special is that after the civil nuclear agreement, this is the first major collaboration between India and the US on something that is so fundamentally tied to our national security implications. So that's the reason I think it was highlighted the way it was. That's the reason that it's being taken up at the leadership level the way it is. And I think it's got an enormous amount of promise for India. It's got an enormous amount of promise as a strategic asset for the Quad. It's got an enormous amount of potential for our growing net security ambitions as a country.
So, is there a timeline for this? And can India adapt and deploy this technology for any indigenous application? Or is that going to be restricted?
That's the whole point, right? The whole point is that once you have the technology transfer for the manufacturing, you would be able to fill domestic capability gaps, right? You would be able to reduce the current import bill. More importantly than the actual forex spend is the import dependency. I'll give you an example. A lot of the countries from which we import these critical technologies are at war. We're dependent on whether their domestic capability can fulfill their own war efforts or export to us. And that puts us in a very tricky situation, right? That puts us in a very vulnerable situation. Electronics are also no longer so simple that you can plug and play. One particular product not only has to be able to integrate into a larger system, but then that's both the product and the system have to be qualified. And usually that entire process is years and millions of dollars in expense. So the only way for us to have that sort of backbone and to make sure that we're not reacting to geopolitical changes is to have our own sovereign supply chain. And that is the whole point of this, is that by setting up this infrastructure in country, we should be able to meet most of our domestic requirements going forward.
Vrinda, I understand that the US is obviously the source of this technology. Now, what does India bring to the table that has made it easier for the US to agree to this transfer of technology?
So I'll answer that question in 2 points, right? First, I'll talk about it from a geopolitical side, and then I'll talk about it from a capacity and capability side. So the first is the geopolitical side. So the world is divided on pretty much everything today. And we see that even in the US, right? The two sides are divided on pretty much everything. But there is one issue on which there is consensus. There are two issues, rather, on which there are absolute consensus bipartisan. The first is that China is the single largest threat to the current global order. And the second is that India is the only bet to China. Right? So with that in the background, why would this partnership materialize? This partnership does not materialize until there is a relationship of equals. And in this case, massive capacity development that has gone in over the last 25 years to building semiconductor design capability in India has yielded that dividend. India is today home to 20% of the global semiconductor design talent. Every major global company has a back office in India. Bangalore is the silicon capital of India, which means that we have more volume of manpower, highly skilled manpower, than any other country in the world. Point number one. Point number two, our workforce is young, whereas in the West, most of the new graduates are not bothering with hardware. They're going into the high-paying software jobs, which means, A, they have a declining number of people entering semiconductor design, but also overall, it's an aging workforce. So this is really a relationship which is a partnership, right? We bring value to the table and we ask for value in return. Otherwise, there is no sustainability to these relationships. Our fundamental belief over here was that A, you should be able to be a partner and not just asking for in a relationship. So you need to have enough technological capacity at your end that you can bring value to the other side. But the second flip side of that is you also have to have good enough people on your side to be able to absorb knowledge, not just a technology transfer, because that itself is incapacitating, right? It binds you in a very different way. It binds you in your inability to move forward from it without going back to the source. So not only are we in a position to contribute back, but we are also in a position to inherit a technology and then grow it at our end. Both things are equally important. And the third is with a declining workforce in these technologies in the West, over time, capacity is going to be a problem. So if we're able to inherit this technology in India and we're going to be able to build alongside with our partners in the US, we have a chance of maintaining a resilient supply chain for ourselves, for our partners in the US, and for friendly allied countries.
See, from what you said, it's a clear win-win deal for both sides.
Yes.
And also, India is acquiring a certain critical capability at
Yes.
the end of this process. So,
Absolutely.
does this mark the benchmark moment for a generational shift? Like you pointed out, the civil nuclear deal was one benchmark. So, is this the second benchmark where you're going to see a technological cooperation across sectors between the two countries?
So again, I'll answer your question with going back about 2 years in time. When we go back to the launch of the ISET, the Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology Initiative between India and the US, I believe it was, if I recall correctly, it was approved by President Biden and Prime Minister Modi in 2022, and it got kicked off by NSA Doval and NSA Sullivan in January of last year. I think a lot of people missed the point of what they were trying to do. I think what the point was to create outcomes of this nature. Very often, when we talk about defense cooperation, you'll hear everything that can't be done. You'll hear all of the baggage of the past. You'll hear they'll never allow it, or you'll hear a lot of rumbling about export control policies. What I think the whole point was, and I have to give credit to the leadership of both countries in this one change in vision. So yes, it was industry to industry, it was not government to government. So all of those things, but the one change in vision was bringing startups into the equation. Because if you want disruptive outcomes, you have to bring in people who don't have those hangovers of the past, who don't have the hangovers of everything that goes wrong. All of a sudden, you've created a disruption in the thought process. So, if as an example, what the Ministry of Defense here in India did when they launched the IDET scheme was bring a very, very disruptive element into otherwise a very stagnated system. And we're seeing the outcomes starting to happen now. Right? These are long gestation plans. It's the same thing with ISET. I think that the idea that you had a blank canvas and you could literally try and reach for the moon is sometimes clouded by people's own baggage and experience. So I think that this is a result of that generational shift that happened during that conversation between the leaders of both countries, the launch of the ISET initiative. And now this is a response to that. This is the natural outcome of a shift in how two countries think of each other. I think it's been 20 years of reconciling interests between India and the United States. And we're finally at a point where partnering is a survival instinct for both sides.
It's actually a nice segue into my next question, that this deal itself is very interesting, at least from the Indian perspective. You have the government to government presence in this deal, the Department of Defense and the Indian semiconductor mission. And you have startups, including yours. So how does this one coexist, because this is something new in India, where defense startups like yours are being given this pride of place? And secondly, is this going to be the template going forward from all that you just said?
So frankly, I think it should be the template, right? I mean, we've seen this in the US ecosystem. A couple of weeks ago, a defense startup in the US raised $1.5 billion in funding. Right? It's challenging the primes. It's challenging how manufacturing should happen. It's a new reality. It's a new world. Look at the war in Ukraine. Right? We're seeing disruptive elements across the board. The point is that businesses look at SpaceX. And startups is not a conversation about scale. It's not a conversation about funding. It's a conversation about disruption. I think very often in our definitions of startups, we think of them as small companies. There's another word for that, that's an MSME. But I think the fundamental definition of a startup is disruptive, the ability to think in a disruptive way.
It's actually very fascinating, Vrinda, that what you're implying in all of this is that there has been a fundamental mindset shift within this country. There is another great example is ISRO, which the government of India opened up to
Yes.
commercial entities like yours to join. We have some fantastic stories already out there in the satellite business. Now you're saying the same thing is happening to defense. So, which is interesting because the buyer of all this technology is mostly a government, like in ISRO or in this case, the army or the defense or navy. So, are you witnessing this user experience, a change? You did mention that they reached out to you, but are you seeing this as a pattern or an exception?
It's a pattern, right? If you really think about it, the government, any government, becomes the single largest buyer of anything. If you look at the number of pens that the government of India buys, the number of chairs that the government of India buys, the number of boxes of mithai the government of India buys, to the number of high-end electronics and components or high-end platforms, the government is the single largest aggregate market in any country. So when the government makes such fundamental shift to buy local, markets shift accordingly. And that trickle down effect happens down to every level. It's a slow process. And this is not, there's an old saying in Hindi, जब हाथी चलता है आराम से चलता है, नहीं तो पूरे forest को कुचलता है. So that shift happens slowly. It's been 5 years now since that shift in mindset. But the impact of that is palpable on the ground. And
So
the
fi-
more success stories convert, the more emboldened the government becomes to push new policy reforms. So it kind of then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy over time.
So you believe we have crossed the tipping point here?
I believe that inflection point is ongoing. Right? I believe that something was seeded 5 or 6 years ago. It's reaching an inflection point. I believe we'll see that inflection point play out over the next 2-3 years, and then it will become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So basically, we are seeing a very happy convergence of trends here. At one level, the bilateral relationship between the two countries, then a generation of startups like yours, who with disruptive powers entering the scene, getting a chance, right? I mean, things seem to be getting together, including, of course, geopolitics.
Yes. You call it the perfect storm, right? It's when multiple different factors align to create an otherwise unlikely outcome. While we all work in our own micro environments, right? If you have the macro tailwinds pushing you and you're able to ride that, then the kind of growth you can see is very phenomenal.
Vrinda is so right. The stars are perfectly aligned for India and US to grow their relationship. It's actually amazing to see this progress Because remember, this relationship is not very old. It was only 25 years ago that Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the then Prime Minister, ignored domestic discontent and took the bold step to forge a relationship with the United States. Subsequent regimes on both sides have invested in this relationship to grow it. Now, the stage is set for the relationship to grow even further. And the binding glue now is technology and business. As they say, money talks. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to StratNews Global on YouTube. Hit the bell icon so that you don't miss any updates. And please, to share your thoughts, ideas and suggestions with us. I'm available on Twitter at Capital Calculus. I'll be back next week with another episode. Till then, stay safe.